And the reading is excellent. It spells out what the challenges are and how little progress we have made toward them over recent years. And he raises a lot of questions. Do we still have a viable two-state solution? Is there a one-state solution? If there is, what is it? The threat of a nuclear weapon from Iran. Has it been extinguished? Can you extinguish it without having some kind of diplomatic agreement? No matter how much bombing that you do, can they still try to get a bomb without anybody noticing? North Korea did it. So it's not beyond pale that Iran could do the same thing. So these are all the issues that he raises and he goes through. And then there's the whole issue of how much we're putting into this to try to resolve it. There's a study that shows that we've put in $25 to $50 billion in resources to try to come up with a program that works in the Middle East. We have 19 bases there with roughly 40,000 personnel. And, what are all these people doing at a time that we're trying to pivot to Asia, which is what we've been trying to do since the time of Obama. So, and basically now that we're no longer relying upon the area for most of our oil, most of the oil there is going to China. So are we putting these assets there to protect the oil? That's a very interesting question. There are three little aphorisms, two of which I mentioned last time, and I'll repeat again because I think that they so kind of wrap up what the situation is in the Middle East. Richard Haas, who is the president emeritus of the Council of Foreign Relations, says the Middle East is the only place where the enemy of your enemy is still your enemy. And then he also said it's one of those places when people talk about how things have to get worse before they get better. Not in the Middle East. They have to get worse over there. And then I saw just a week ago on Zoom, I saw David Reyes, who was in charge of charge of all forces in Iraq and U.S. command for the whole area, and then the head of the CIA. And he was talking about this policy that we've been trying to do ever since the days of Obama, of leaving the Middle East and pivoting to Asia. Petraeus' take on it is that leaving the Middle East is like Michael Corleone trying to leave the mafia. So, with those kind of few introductory words, I will say we're very happy tonight that Ed Barr volunteered his son to answer all these questions. This, as I don't know how many of you know, he grew up here as a kid on Shelter Island, did the yachting program and all of those things. He started as a lawyer and then decided there were better things to do with one's life than be a lawyer. And since 2013, he's been working with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee through both Democratic and Republican administrations. He is a member of the World Affairs Council up in Maine. So he is thoroughly familiar with all these issues. And with that, I will turn it over to Chris so that he can answer the questions that have been raised. Thank you, Chris.
Well, thanks everyone for being really great to be back, not just to see my folks, but to see a lot of familiar faces here on Shelter Island and a lot of familiar places. And I was telling Iqbal, we'll start with a little bit of geography. If on the evening of June 22nd, after the strikes on Iran's nuclear program, you're going maybe to Hay Beach or maybe Real Point and turn north and listen very closely, you hear this faint tapping sound on the wind. That was me in northern New England, frantically deleting and rewriting parts of this. So I will do the best I can, but this is it's a lovely and wonderful and beautiful region, but it is not known for its stability or its consistency. I will say one aphorism I have about the pivot to China is that when you pivot, you're still standing in the same place.
Nice.
I pivoted. I might be looking to China, but I'm still standing in the middle of this. So with that, let's get started. I just want to give Kirk gave me a great introduction. I just want to talk a little bit more about myself to give you a little bit of grounding and understanding about where I come from. So he's right. I was on the professional staff, the Democratic staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee from 2013 to 2025. I worked under 3 chairman or ranking members, chairman when Democrats had the majority in the Senate, ranking member when we were in the minority. But as such, Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution is a big thing for me. And that means congressional oversight, congressional power to declare war, or to initiate or to authorize the use of military force. My portfolio, Middle East and North Africa. I also covered non-proliferation, so Iran, but also other things, chemical weapons, biological weapons, stuff like that. Really kind of, happy, uplifting stuff. And then international financial institutions. This is me with our deputy chief counsel on the committee. We are at the Egyptian side of the Rafah crossing into Gaza. I'm the guy on the right. This was February of 2024. And so as a congressional staff member, I had a bunch of oversight committees. These are things that kind of I think about: security, economic, and humanitarian assistance, government programs, U.S. government funds that go abroad to help other countries and other people. Our diplomatic engagement. When Kirk was a foreign service officer, he would have come to our committee for his to clear up his promotions. If he needed to brief one of our bosses, one of the senators, he would have probably talked to me first. And then weapons sales. So all the weapons that we sell throughout the world need to be cleared by the United States government first. And as such, they need to be cleared by certain committees, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee being one of them. So this is a broad area. I was thinking a lot about how to present this, and I didn't want to just kind of have it be limited to kind of the news of the day. I think we're often kind of chasing headlines. So what I wanted to talk about were a bit of a run of show: available U.S. policy tools, U.S. policy priorities for the Middle East and North Africa region writ large, how those policy priorities and the tools used are changing under President Trump, because we're seeing a lot of change here. And then we can have a discussion of specific countries. I'm thinking of Iran, Israel, West Bank, Gaza, Syria, Lebanon. But having said that, this is the region I was responsible for. Wow. From the Atlantic coast of North Africa all the way to Iran. So if you've got questions in that area, fire away. I will say, I can talk a little bit about Turkey, this part of Africa called the Sahel. My analysis starts to degrade the further away from this core that we get. And I will say, it reminds me of a time in 2015. I was meeting with a bunch of European journalists, and it was 2015, so I figured they were going to want to talk about the last iteration of the Israel-Gaza conflict. They'd want to talk about the Iran nuclear agreement that was happening at the time, and Syria. So that's kind of what I focused on as I was preparing. First question out of the box: Belgian journalist wanted to know what the ranking member's position was on Western Sahara. It's right here. And so I couldn't tell her that like it had been months since I talked to him about Western Sahara. So I talked to him about MINURSO, which is the UN, the UN mandate, the mandated UN mission there, and the need for a referendum that took into account all the residents of Western Sahara. And we had this like brief and weird standoff where she was incredulous that the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee didn't have this super detailed and nuanced national policy position on Western Sahara. And I was equally incredulous that she would blow her one question with me on Western Sahara. So that said, I just want you to, this is kind of the area that I am talking about. But having said that, I think it's important that we also talk about the other side of US foreign policy, which is the Department of Defense and our ability to project military power. And in that, we have regional combatant commands and areas of responsibility. So we are going to be talking mostly about CENTCOM, specifically this little part of CENTCOM here. We're also talking about AFRICOM, especially Northern Africa, a little bit about EUCOM, which is Europe, and then INDOPACOM, which is the Indian Ocean and Pacific Oceans. NORTHCOM and SOUTHCOM, they're on their own. And so what I want to point out, and this I'll hit this a couple times, is that it's called Central Command for a reason, and it is at the center of everything. Shipping from the North Atlantic, between the North Atlantic and South and East Asia, energy shipping, commercial shipping, US naval assets have to pass through at least 4 choke points. Gibraltar, the Strait of Sicily between Sicily and Tunisia, the Suez Canal, and the Bab el-Mandeb at the bottom of the Red Sea. And then some of them have to kind of turn in and go through the Hormuz. These are fine. This, as we've seen in the news, remains a hostile and contested transit. And it is having significant impacts on US shipping, energy markets, including oil and gas, which are fungible commodities, and possibly our ability to project power into the US INDOPACOM AOR. So just keep that in mind as we're talking through all this. So, in general, my sense of US policy in the Middle East, and when I say Middle, I might kind of lapse into, I might say MENA, I'm saying Middle East and North Africa, which is that map that I showed you. Traditional US policy in the Middle East has been regional stability, especially supporting regional partners, whether that's the Egyptians, the Israelis, the Jordanians, Lebanese, Iraqis, while at the same time promoting American values, including human rights, free and fair elections, civil society, also the free flow of goods and energy, like I just said, with the flow of shipping through those choke points, countering US adversaries, specifically, most importantly, China, Iran, Russia, all of which have kind of greater or lesser presences in the Middle East. Adherence to a rules-based international order is through the UN multilateral system, multilateral assistance, and US diplomatic leadership, and then the ability for the US military to project power into those AORs, CENTCOM and INDOPACOM. Our traditional foreign policy tools, and this is kind of, we can see kind of where it's been and where it's headed. Obviously, there's military action through CENTCOM and AFRICOM assets. We just saw that, as I was kind of frantically rewriting my presentation on June 22nd. We also have Treasury and State Department sanctions. These are basically kind of blocking who we consider bad actors from the US financial system. Not just them, but people potentially who are doing business with. And that is kind of, that's not military force, but it is a very coercive thing. And we've seen it most famously with Iran, the sanction of Iran. Most effectively, we've probably seen it with Syria in the fall of the Assad regime, where sanctions had a big role. Security partner capacity building, that's really security assistance. So giving funds to, say, the Egyptians to build up their military, giving the Israelis funds to build up their military, their missile defense, which they do a lot of research on, but is largely funded through US security assistance. Economic and humanitarian assistance, making people's lives better or at least a little less worse in the Middle East, relieves migrant flows and potentially keeps those folks staying in the Middle East and not feeling like they have to get on a half-swamped rubber dinghy to cross the Mediterranean and the English Channel. U.S. U.S. economic statecraft, advocating for U.S. companies, free trade deals, good old-fashioned U.S. diplomacy, like the kind that Kirk was involved in, coalition building, not boots on the ground, more like latex on the ground. And then public diplomacy. This is the quiet part of U.S. soft power. This includes foreign students, the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, all those things that kind of promote U.S. values and U.S. culture abroad. Really quickly, this is a bit of an alphabet soup, but U.S. foreign assistance is a huge part of that. There's multilateral assistance that we send to the UN, and there's bilateral assistance that we send to directly to other countries. State Department, I crossed out USAID. USAID has been fully rolled up, and we will be watching the effects of that in real time. There's foreign military financing. I just talked about security assistance, economic support funds. That's been significantly reduced. Foreign military financing, the Israelis are still definitely getting it. The Egyptians are still definitely getting it. The Jordanians are getting a little bit. And then after that, it's not clear. But there are other countries that really need it. NADR is a lot of demining and explosives removal. This INCL is how we supported the Palestinian Authority and their security forces. That's completely gone. These were people that work hand in glove with the Israeli Defense Forces on security cooperation, and our funding for them was about $35, $40 million a year. As far as I know, it's either gone or on its way out. IDA, Food for Peace, is just straight up food assistance, feeding hungry people. We also have Defense Department. 333 is weapon systems, and 332 is training on those systems. There's also this counter-ISIS training and equipment. That's a whole other thing, but it's mainly for Syria and Iraq to kind of beat down the ribbons of ISIS. So, how I see policy priorities changing under President Trump. We're getting more transactional foreign policy, possibly more political and personal, with an emphasis on a straight line benefit to the U.S. or political wins. So there's less acceptance of the kind of it's a bit of a nebulous argument, but for something like humanitarian assistance, it's hard to say that directly benefits the United States, except that it's mostly food that's purchased by U.S. farmers. And so the argument is it makes things more stable in the Middle East, and that helps U.S. security. There's less tolerance and less acceptance for that kind of an argument. There's a reassessment of adversaries and partners, how to deal with it. Europeans are trying to figure out how they deal with this new administration, and how are they going to cooperate with the United States in the midst of trying to negotiate tariffs and having tariffs slapped on them. There's going to be far less, we're seeing it now, far less humanitarian and economic assistance and more onerous hoops to jump through them. USAID is gone. The mechanism and the infrastructure through which all that assistance moved is gone. The people that administer it, gone. And so it's going to be a lot more difficult to move that kind of assistance to the extent that the administration even wants to. We will see less and more situational insistence on human rights. So some people, like the Iranians, are going to continue to get others, like partners like Egypt or Iraq, might get a bit of a pass on human rights. And then we'll see, and we've seen it now, the increased reliance on sanctions as a form of economic war, or a way to hollow out an adversary's economy. So what we're seeing is an over-reliance on military action, more transactional and conditional approach to weapon sales and assistance. We've seen a gutting of foreign assistance at all levels and programs and accounts, a gutting of career diplomatic and assistance professional corps. Most recently, just yesterday, 2 days ago, 1,000 foreign service officers fired from the State Department. These are people like Kirk who, put their lives on hold or brought their families with them, often to not hospitable places, and did the hard work of talking to people who are either aligned with us or maybe not aligned with us. And a lot of them are gone. And then the gutting of public diplomacy tools. like the Voice of America, the International Visitors and Leadership Program, and foreign students. That's not some of that is through the State Department and foreign policy. Some of it is the kind of heavy-handed ICE immigration raids that you're seeing and foreign students getting snapped up. Okay. The big phrase that kind of stuck with me about the Middle East before October 7th was actually talking about Egypt, but I think it applies to the larger region. It's quiet, but it's not stable. Things are quiet. People aren't necessarily talking, but there's this undercurrent of instability and angst running through the region. And we saw that. Iran had an expanded proxy network, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iraqi militias, and we saw rapid enrichment after the U.S. withdrew from the JCPOA. That's the previous nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Yemen, there was a ceasefire. That was good, less killing, and less humanitarian concern. People weren't starving, but the Houthis were consolidating power, and we're starting to see what's happening because of it. ISIS, down but not out. They're still down. They're very much not out. Hamas, we clearly underestimated them, both in their capacity and their ideology. Some people thought it was a good faith effort to maintain space for a two-state solution. Others might have been a more cynical effort of undermining other parts of Palestinian civil society and the Palestinian Authority in order to say that there's no partner to talk to about a two-state solution. Everyone underestimated Hamas and both its capacity to do what it did on October 7th and its ideology and willingness to do that worse. Syria, on the other hand, we really overestimated the durability of the Assad regime. I like to pepper in some kind of like witty things. My big thing for Syria is that no one saw this coming. Nobody. Me included. As I was watching it happen, me and my colleagues were just, are you seeing this? Can you believe this? If anyone tells you that they saw the fall of the Assad regime coming, they are either lying to you or they are Turkish intelligence. Either way, you should probably reevaluate your relationship with that. Israel and the West Bank. We saw a rightward shift in Israeli politics accelerating. The Knesset has increasingly kind of moved, the Israeli parliament has increasingly moved further right. And we've seen settler expansion in the West Bank. But we did see momentum building for regional integration of Israel. We saw the Abraham Accords under President Trump, really great. And then we saw a deepening, not exactly an expansion, because no one else really came in, but we saw a deepening of those accords under President Biden, where defense cooperation, tech cooperation, agriculture, healthcare, all these things, all these connections were being built out between Israel and members of the Arab countries that had, to a more or less extent, normalized relations with Israel. Egypt, we saw fiscal issues and political straitjacket for Egyptians, but also for President Sisi. We saw the Egyptian military start to kind of eat the Egyptian private sector. And it's become very hard for the Egyptian private sector, including construction companies, to outcompete the Egyptian military, which has a lot of fingers in the private sector. Lebanon, political paralysis, and Hezbollah blocking any kind of move towards a political solution while at the same time kind of building up their own status in southern Lebanon. The Gulf, UAE, really in Saudi Arabia, we saw social liberalization but also political consolidation. Here in the United States, I think a lot of people have a lot of concern about Mohammed bin Salman and maybe his human rights record, what he did to Jamal Khashoggi. They love him in Saudi Arabia. He has liberalized society in a way that it's made him a legend with younger Saudis. Like he has marginalized the what we call kind of colloquially the rules of these things. They have far less power to enforce things with younger Saudis, and they absolutely love that. Jordan, we saw social cohesion starting to buckle and strain. Jordan just cannot get its economy together and has been dependent for a long time on a lot of U.S. Economic assistance, about $845 million a year in U.S. economic assistance helps to keep that country afloat. And it's important because Jordan is a super important ally, not just for us, but also for the Israelis. And we can talk about that a little later if we talk about the kind of missile exchanges that we saw between the Israelis and the Iranians. The Jordanians played a big role in that on the Israeli side. So what we have is a clearly unstable region. But the U.S. is not the only loser. And I would say it's not even the biggest loser. For all the talk that we had about October 7th and what it was going to do to American standing, all those concerns are true. Iran, I would say, is by far the biggest loser. And it happened kind of like a bankruptcy, little by little, and then all of a sudden all at once. Syria and Lebanon. But where do we go? And then the question we can ask ourselves is, where do we go after these U.S.-Israeli strikes? Syria and Lebanon, we've got opportunity, but we're starting to run out of time. We've seen a right-wing consolidation in Israel. Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich hold a lot of leverage over Prime Minister Netanyahu for political and reasons having to do with this trial that we can talk about a little bit more. We've seen a worsening of the Gaza conflict and more settler violence in the West Bank. And what I'm afraid is going to be a death spiral of the two-state solution if there's no viable, if there's no way to a viable Palestinian state. We start to see a death spiral for that solution. And I'm struck by what King Abdullah Jordan said to one of the senators I worked for. I asked him the same question: is there still a two-state solution? And is it worth going for? And he said, if you don't have a two-state solution, we end up in a very dark place. And to hear Jordan say that, said, even as a little staffer, it sends shivers down your spine. In Yemen, with these, just had a chokehold on Red Sea shipping. We thought, maybe they put that to bed with the last round of airstrikes. Clearly not. They just sank 2 more ships. If one of them goes down in the shipping channel, you could see something similar to when that big boat got itself wedged in the Suez Canal. Effects on shipping, energy market, U.S. free movement. And then there's increased potential, especially if we start getting really transactional with our assistance. There's increased potential for the Gulf, especially Saudi and Emirati influence with aid recipients like Egypt and Jordan. The UAE, in the past maybe year and a half, bailed out the Egyptian government with a massive real estate deal on Egypt's northern shore, Ras Al Hikmah, $50-something billion, basically pulled Egypt out of a financial spiral. And the last thing I'll say on that is that if a lot of their assistance or a lot of their financial well-being is coming from Gulf monarchies, it makes them more receptive or attuned to what those monarchies want rather than what we want. So my concern, and again, I work on the Democratic side of the committee, and so I've got kind of, I have very specific concerns, but I like to think that I call balls and strikes for my senators. Likely exacerbated instability. Gutting the funding and processes for foreign assistance. It's going to undermine partners and provide an opening for adversaries in Gulf monarchies. We're seeing the realization of increased potential for military action against Iran. We just saw it. Far fewer checks on a right-wing Netanyahu government. One of the last things I did while I was there was my Senate, I'm not taking credit, was pushing the Biden administration to put sanctions on extremist Israeli settlers that were attacking Palestinians in the West Bank. And we sanctioned settlers, we sanctioned the organizations that supported them. I thought I was worried that those sanctions would come down in February, after like mid to late February, after the Trump administration. They came down on January 21st. Maybe the 20th. There was a lot happening on the 20th, and so it's hard to tell. And we'll see a lack of advocacy for human rights and the law of armed conflict or humanitarian assistance is going to lead to more repression and more of this quiet but not stable, where people are very unhappy about this, about where things are headed in their country, but there's no outlet for it. There's no release valve through protest and civil society, and all that pressure builds. And the question is, does it explode, and how does it explode? And then we're going to see possibly continuing readiness issues for maintaining a carrier strike group presence in the CENTCOM AOR with hostile Red Sea transits. Our China doctrine right now envisioned, and I think Jody's son might know a little bit better about this. He's the China expert, but our China doctrine, military doctrine, envisions 0 carrier strike groups in the CENTCOM AOR. It's going to be largely a naval fight if it happens, God forbid. Last I checked, there were 2 floating around in either the Red Sea or the northern Indian Ocean. We have 11 of these things. And generally, at least half of them are in some form of dry dock or repairs, which really means we have life. If 2 of them, or even 1 of them, has to stay parked in the northern Indian Ocean, that becomes a problem as we're trying to kind of wage a naval battle. Also, as we're trying to flow assets, if every single Red Sea transit is a hostile transit and you burn through half of your interceptors trying to slap down Houthi missiles, what does that mean for when you finally get in theater in China? To say nothing of what it does to our stocks of these interceptors and munitions, which don't immediately happen. It takes time to build. All right. So if we have time, I wanted to run through some specific countries.
Good idea.
Okay, great. So, Iran. We have had some dueling assessments. Residents said obliterated. The Defense Intelligence Agency said, the consensus that I'm seeing forming is that we've set back their nuclear program 2 years, which is something, but it's not the whole thing. And so if that's true, we have about a 2-year breakout time for Iran's able to sprint for a bomb. And the question is, what do we do with that time? Permanent solution, and Kirk alluded to this, it has to be diplomatic. There's no way to bomb your way out of it. We've already found, even with this 2-year setback, the Iranians moved a bunch of their 30% enriched uranium out. We didn't get all the centrifuges. The centrifuges, in my opinion, are the most important because you can't get to 90% enriched uranium without it. And we can't bomb our way out of this. It's going to need to be diplomatic. And so, I will say, we have a diplomatic agreement. But what's it going to look like? How is it going to compare to the agreement that we had? I think that the main difference with the JCPOA and the biggest sticking point in any negotiations that happen is going to be enrichment. The JCPOA, and this is where a lot of the criticism happened, my criticism of the JCPOA, a big part of it, was that it allowed for enrichment at the end of the deal. And we're coming up on the end of that original deal. October 15th is what's called Termination Day, which is when all the supposed limits of Iran's ability to enrich are lifted. And they are allowed to do it. The other thing that happens is that the possibility of what's called snapback sanctions lift and go away. So I would watch this space in the next 2 weeks, maybe August. It really depends on kind of like how much the UN is willing to work in August. We might see we actually just saw the French foreign minister threaten that snapback sanctions as the way to try to push Iran to a deal. I think what they're going to try to do is try to hammer out a deal before this October 15th termination day. And so they're going to need to, but we're going to need to see what that looks like. I think like I said, the sticking point is going to be enrichment. I think the Israelis are going to be strongly in favor of zero enrichment. I think it's going to be hard for an administration to get this passed, Republicans in Congress, without zero enrichment. There might be a way that they can kind of fiddle with that on what's called the back end by allowing some enrichment for medical purposes or something like that. But that's going to be the big sticking point. And that leads me to my next point. There is an act I helped write, the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, which requires any administration making a nuclear deal with Iran to present that deal to Congress. And so they would most likely have to. But how that happens, it remains to be seen. And the question is going to be, are Republicans in Congress going to stop an Iran deal that maybe they're not super happy with and cross the administration, or are they going to try to pick their battles? I'm not quite sure how that happens. I would be surprised if they submit it to Congress and then nothing happens. There's no vote, and then there's a 60-day time limit, and after that, Congress's ability to cancel the deal goes away. We might see that happen, but in the meantime, I would hope that at the very least we see a flurry of hearings and a flurry of hearings kind of inspecting the deal and different aspects of the deal. Their proxy network is substantially degraded. Hezbollah's on its back foot. The Assad regime is just gone. The Iraqi militias are laying low, but the Houthis are still there, being annoying in the southern Red Sea, and that's going to continue to be an issue. And then we're going to see what happens if there's no agreement. One thing that's going to happen is this snapback of all the UN sanctions and multilateral European Union sanctions and US sanctions that I talked about. But do we have to go back into military force? And if that's the case, what kind of authority is Congress going to give? Or are they going to cede authority to the administration? And how would that work with the war powers privilege? We just saw Senator Kaine in the Senate and Representatives Massey, a Republican, and Hanna, Democrat, in the House, put forth a joint resolution to try to limit that power. Both votes failed. I would imagine that they will continue to fail, but I think it's still worth it. It's still worth doing because this is an important, like I said, an Article 1 guy, and this is an important power, and I think we've ceded probably too much of it to not just this administration, but any administration. We're also going to see diminished munitions and what I call interceptors. So we've seen Israeli air defense put on an absolute clinic shooting down Iranian rockets. They have a limited number of those things. And what the Iranians are shooting at them, Iron Dome can't catch. This is higher up in their architecture. And they're potentially running out of those interceptors. We have helped them, but we are running out of our own interceptors. The Jordanians because the optics inside Jordan aren't great, but there are Jordanian F-16s flying back and forth over Jordan, like knocking these things down. They're running interceptors. And so, question: if we get into another shooting war, what runs out first? Israeli interceptors or Iranian missiles? One of the great things about Israel's air defense and why things like Iron Dome are so important is that it actually frees the Israelis up to be less escalatory. It is a much different thing entirely if one of these big things gets through and it's an apartment block in Tel Aviv. And then Israeli leaders have to deal with that and form an appropriate response. If they're slapping these things down over Jordan or they're landing in empty fields, it allows the Israelis to pick and choose their targets and to not necessarily hit things so hard. That goes for Israel. It also went for Gaza. Israel, Palestinians, Gaza, West Bank. It's a lot, but I'll try to fit it in. Gaza ceasefire, there are still fundamental differences, and it's hard to see them getting bridged. I think the crux currently appears to be Hamas remaining in Gaza, and then the IDF presence in Gaza. Right now, the IDF is in two big corridors. One is called the Philadelphia corridor, which is along the border of Egypt, where you saw the picture of me. The other is the Morag corridor, which goes through like Wadi Gaza and the middle of the Gaza Strip. That kind of splits Gaza in half. And it also stops any kind of weapon smuggling from Egypt, which I thought, which a lot of us thought we had dealt with, but it's still a problem. The two sides are still not in the same spot on this. Secondary, but still important, is the provision of humanitarian assistance and who provides it. This Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, I forget what it is not working. What was there before also had problems. It was very good at getting assistance to Palestinians, but it was also being used by Hamas as cover, or for Hamas to steal or to tax. And the question, well, what's happening now, making desperate and already traumatized Palestinians walk across a conflict zone to come to a specific spot to pick up assistance and then walk back with it, all the while running the risk of either being shot by the IDF or now shot by the people, by the contractors that are doing security at this foundation, these foundation sites, is not a good fix. And I think it's worse than what was there before. We also have Israeli domestic politics providing a through line. I will say that I think Benjamin Netanyahu's core operating objective is to stay out of jail. He is facing the corruption charge that he's been fighting 2 years now, maybe more. And as long as he's prime minister, he doesn't go to jail. And as long as he's prime minister, he has a shot at reforming the Israeli justice system and undermining the Israeli attorney general in a way that allows him to dodge this corruption charge. And so the only way that he avoids that right now is to stay prime minister. That is combined with his overweening belief that he's the only person equipped to handle this crisis. And those two things are kind of working. And so he is dependent on an extremely right-wing coalition. And the Knesset, it's 120 seats, 61 gets you a majority. He's got like 65, which means any party in his coalition can bring it down. And both Ben Gvir and Smotrich have threatened to do just that if he ends the Gaza war, the Gaza conflict on terms that they don't like. In the meantime, Bezalel Smotrich runs the Ministry of Finance, and he is supporting a lot of gross settlement policies in the West Bank that make it extremely difficult for Palestinians to either live their lives or to build a functioning civil society. Netanyahu I think he's probably trying to kind of like wait out the bad polling, and we've seen his polling improve. He's pulled off some, but the Israeli defense forces and the defense establishment have pulled off some real coups. They've taken down Hezbollah. Syria followed after. They put on an absolute clinic with the Iranians. And so he will try to make a case, if it comes to elections, that he is still the person to do this. He had a funny ad years ago where he called himself the babysitter. Where he was like, I'm the only person that you can trust with your family. The babysitter, Bibi Netanyahu. I think the question is there a ceiling that he can't get past? Because, while he's got this coalition, 74 or 75% of Israelis want him to do a deal and bring the hostages home. And the longer that goes on, God forbid, they lose those remaining hostages. That is going to be a stain on him that potentially follows him in the Israeli electorate whenever there's another election. Syria. Like I said, don't believe anyone who saw this coming. The Assad regime was a massive loss for Iran and Hezbollah. And I would say that it's the reason, it is the reason that Hezbollah is going to have a really hard time building itself back up. If you can imagine a map, I've got some maps later on that we can go to as we're doing questions, but the path from Iran to Lebanon first goes through Iraq and then Syria. Syria is closed off. That means no overbuilding shipments, sophisticated weaponry to Hezbollah. And that is huge for the Israelis. Lifting sanctions on Syria, this is where the balls and strikes come in. It was a good move. I gotta hand it to President Trump. Lifting sanctions on Syria is a big deal. It's good policy, and it's good for Syria and the region. This is what I was talking about. We're running out of time. Syria's economy is in tatters from 15 years or more of conflicts. Lifting those sanctions, it allows people to do business. It allows the Syrian diaspora to send remittances and invest money. It allows the Gulf, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates to fund parts of the Syrian government and to invest in Syria. It's really important. But they're not out of the woods. And gutting U.S. assistance is making things harder and more complicated. We've seen that some of the programs that were going to find accountability for the crimes of the Assad regime against the people of Syria, those ran out of money because we stopped funding them just in the past couple of months. That's one example. This guy, Ahmed al-Shara, formerly July, the one consistent thing about this guy is his adaptability. It's amazing. He got sent by Ayad al-Baghdadi to be ISIS's man in Syria. And from there, people are now talking about whether he has it in him to make a normalization deal between Syria and Israel. It's just wild. But the one comforting thing, I think, is like he is not an ISIS hedgehog. He is whatever he needs to be in a moment. And that, in a place like Syria, in a place like the Middle East, that gives me a little bit of confidence. Russia and Iran are down but not out. Chaos and sectarian violence helps them. Iran's going to try to rebuild its network. Russia is trying desperately to hold on to a naval base in Tartus on the Mediterranean and an air base in a province called Latakia, also on the Mediterranean. They're trying, and the more chaos there is, the more that Giuliani feels like he needs to kind of deal with the Russians to kind of help his vision of Syria along, the easier it's going to be for them. I think an open question, as we're seeing today, is whether the Kurds in the northeast, the Druze in the south, are willing and able to integrate or reintegrate with this transitional government. We've seen some fighting happening in the south where transition government fighters are coming into a town called Soweto, which is predominantly Druze, but it's run by a particular group of Druze that has been extremely unhelpful. But they've got connections with the Israelis, and we've seen the Israelis doing airstrikes on Syrian transition government fighters in support of that. So whether we're able to kind of get this particular Druze to get the program with the other Druze in Syria is going to be important. And the Druze, just super quick aside, the Druze are an important constituency in Israel. They're small, there's about 180,000 of them. And they speak Arabic, they have their own kind of religion, which is hard to understand, but they are fully Israeli. And Israeli Jews are very sensitive to them and their needs and their concerns about their Druze brethren in other parts of the Middle East. I will say one quick point is Druze boys enlist or conscripted into the IDF alongside Jewish boys and girls. So and you see them kind of moving up the ranks, and so like they share that they're not Jewish, But we share in the idea of maintaining Israel as a going concern. And that is important to other Israelis. And it's something to keep in mind as you see the Israelis kind of mucking about in things that affect the Jews in other countries. I could even say that the Israeli-Hezbollah war really kicked off in earnest when Hezbollah shot a missile into the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights, into a Druze town called Majdal Shams, and killed a bunch of Druze kids playing soccer. And it was only then that you saw Israel really take the gloves off. And that's when they killed Nasrallah, and that's when they did the Beeper attack. All right, last one. I promise, and then I'm hoping we can have a good conversation. Lebanon. Near and dear for a bunch of reasons, and to me. Israel's operation against Hezbollah also set the stage for Assad's collapse in Israel. Israel took down Hezbollah, and then Hezbollah was not able to come to the rescue of the Assad regime. And between that and us blocking Iran-backed Shia militias coming in from Iraq, it kind of made it very clear that what little fighting power pro-regime elements in Syria had was seriously degraded and hollowed out, and it just collapsed in a matter of days. Like Syria, we've got an opportunity to turn the corner. Time is limited. This new president, Joseph Aoun, I met him. He's a good guy. I met him when he was the chief of defense for the Lebanese armed forces. He's part of that opportunity, but he needs U.S. support. He especially needs U.S. security assistance because the Lebanese armed forces are tasked with implementing this ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel. And it could cost close to $1 billion. They're getting a fraction of that. And there's a big push to condition assistance to the Lebanese armed forces at a time when they really can't use it. One of the things that I was proudest of was I would work with my Republican colleagues to try to kill these initiatives to condition that assistance. And, at first, it was me and my Republican colleague, like hand in hand, we're going to just let this thing die. Every year, it got harder and harder to get them to go along. Not because they didn't like it, but they were facing pressure from further down, what we call further down the dais, from other rank and file Republicans to condition that assistance. Speaker of Parliament, Nabi Berri, is a Shia, is part of Lebanon's confessional system, where the president has to be Christian, the Speaker of Parliament has to be Shia, the Prime Minister has to be Sunni. He's a longtime Hezbollah and Iranian ally. And when I was there in the House, or in the Senate, we tried to sanction him. And it got to the point where he was sending people to us to argue why we shouldn't sanction him, and it was just like, you're not. The financial crisis that you may have heard of in Lebanon, starting in 2018, it's leveled off mostly because it's just like a dead cat bounce. Like the economy there is completely dollarized. They don't really use the lira; it's all dollars, and so it's hard to kind of go further. It's hard for them to go further once you've hit bottom. But reforms really, really are needed to their banking sector and to their government in general, and those things need to happen. And I'm really concerned that we're not going to see them happen, even with this new president. So that's really it for me. I think what I'll say is, we've all got our own questions. What I would say is questions that I still have are what U.S. foreign policy tools would be left after 4 years of President Trump? And can any be rebuilt after? Or is it worth rebuilding? And if so, what conditions would need to exist? How are other countries responding to Trump's Middle East policy? What are the long-term implications of Trump policy? And how long before the implications of this become really apparent? We start to see them, but this is going to be one of those things that has a long tail. And so the question of how this ends up shaking out is going to be interesting. And then, what tools does Congress have left? Again, as a former congressional staffer, what tools does Congress have left to constrain executive branch actions? This goes across the island. How are we going to to rein in executive action and reassert the form of congressional or not priority, but congressional oversight more than they already have. So I think I'll leave it. Next one for that.
Chris, that was great. Thank you. We all know a lot more than an hour.
Thanks before dinner. No.
Let me take the privilege of having the first question. Let me go back to the military assets. We're spending $25 billion there for 40,000 troops, 18 bases. And what role are they playing generally? And be specifically, did they play a role in the bombings in Iran, where the fighter jets that were used as escorts to escort the bombers in and out, and refueling the tankers? Do you happen to know if they came from the Middle East bases, or the Middle East bases not usable for that because of political reasons?
I don't think they were used because that creates potential blowback, and it makes the countries where those things are based in targets. I don't think so. We've got fighters based in the Emirates called Al-Bafra. I don't think they were used there. We've also got a massive base in Qatar called Al-Udeid. It's possible that maybe fighters based out of there were used. Of course, they did. They did. It was interesting that they chose that. I will say they probably could have pulled this off without any escort. Iran's air defense is extremely degraded, and it was degraded even before this last one. The Israelis got most of their air defense back in April, so they could have. There's the potential that they could have gone in. What was the second?
Well, and generally, is it your view that we still need all those assets, military assets in the region?
I think so. I think those assets played a big role in, like I said, in the air defense conflict between Israel and Iran. And so having those assets there helped knock down a lot of those Iranian missiles, the ones that maybe the Jordanians or Israeli air defense couldn't get, or we get a bunch that's fewer for the Israelis to have to deal with. I think that's really important. I also think, like I said, having a presence. Obviously, I don't think a carrier strike is sustainable in the long term, but having a presence in the Middle East for freedom of navigation, not just of U.S. naval assets, but for shipping. I was telling you yesterday, there are zero energy transits across the through the Red Sea right now. What you're seeing, the ships that you're seeing are mostly bulk containers carrying weight. A bulk container can take a ballistic missile hit and keep limping north. If a liquefied natural gas tanker gets a hit, here's the boom is shatter. And so they've just stopped. And they're not going around Africa. That takes too long. Gulf energy contracts, I think, are mostly being placed eastward, either to China, although China's buying a lot of black market Iranian oil, but other places in either India or other places in Southeast Asia. That's where those contracts are going right now, and that's a medium to long term issue.
Thank you.
They're not going to Europe.
Let's open it up to others. Larry?
You mentioned the opening lot. All the various cutbacks were maybe in that region. There was cutbacks. What's behind it? What's the thinking?
What's behind the cutbacks? So some of it was certainly this misguided attempt to free up funds to pay for possibly a tax cut. We saw that wasn't the case. Anyone who knows anything about foreign policy and foreign assistance knew that was never going to be enough. All U.S. Foreign assistance, humanitarian assistance, economic assistance, security assistance is something like $50 to $55 billion. It is a very small fraction, even of discretionary U.S. funding. It's an even smaller fraction when you take into account things like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. It was never going to get us over the line or anywhere close to the line. I think another part of it was to see what they could get away with. USAID is a congressionally mandated agency, and the Trump administration just took it down, and it's gone. And some of its elements have been wrapped up have been folded into the State Department. But I'm worried that part of it was a proof of concept, and we're starting to see it now with the Department of Education, and you see it with other federal agencies. They took down USAID, really just a bunch of like smart kids trying to make the world a better place. And they showed that they could do it there. I'm showing that they could do it with the Department of Education and see what's next.
Just to add, the estimates are that the loss of the RD is costing maybe 14 million lives.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, PEPFAR is gone. People are, PEPFAR turned AIDS into not the end of your world. It's still bad, but like it became a manageable disease. Now that's gone.
What is the
Let's stick with somebody else.
Thank you very much, Kirk. Very, very interesting picture of the Middle East. So I go back and see the longest conflict in Israel and Palestine since 1948. And you alluded to the fact that, where the conditions are today in Southern Europe, unless you have a Palestinian state, some sort, whether it's two-state solution, whatever, it's not going to happen. How do you see that this is happening, number one? Number two, every time there has been a peace in the Middle East, especially related to Israel, it's always been through the mediation effort of the United States, because they have the leverage. So they're restricted between Egypt, Israel, between Jordan and Israel, and then, of course, the other mission. So how do you see our role going forward? Because, do we have still a leverage? If you see of the events in the past 6 months, I think we have made certain statements, and the Israeli government has not followed it.
Right.
And so without the leverage that we don't have, how can you really bring about two parties together to have a peace solution?
Right. Yeah, it's a good question, and I think there's still leverage, but we are losing pieces of leverage. Before October 7th, I think a lot of the talk circled around the leverage possibly being a normalization agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia had, I was going to say clear, but not exactly clear, but they had things that they were going to need. One of which was a Palestinian state, or at least something that put us on the road, like seriously on the road to a Palestinian state. Not this kind of like, oh, well, we promised to think about it, consider it. Like what the Saudis wanted were irreversible steps towards a Palestinian state. And in return for that and a couple other things, that might be what kind of unlocked the Saudis for a normalization agreement. And with the Saudis potentially come a lot of other people. The Saudis kind of hold pole position in the Muslim world. You get the Saudis, potentially you get the Malaysians. And that's what, 250 million, the largest Muslim country in the world. Indonesia, Indonesia. But it potentially unlocks the Indonesians, and then maybe you can make something out of that.
But not only that, there's a fundamental question here of whether we have leverage or not. Do we have the willpower mean, the statements that you get coming out of some of the members of the administration are things like, Israeli settlements in the West Bank are not necessarily a violation of international law.
Oh,
So it's not even clear. I mean, that
And that's
we're going to push in that direction.
And that's why I bring you back to kind of like what I had said before. We had pushed the Biden administration to sanction violent Israeli settlers. These are people that basically are conducting wrongs in the West Bank against Palestinians. And we had a bunch of them sanctioned. And those sanctions like barely lasted a day when Trump came into office. And so I think that kind of speaks to this lack of willpower. I mean, Trump would pay force a Gaza deal at some point.
It didn't work, right?
It didn't work. It didn't work the first time with Biden. It didn't work the second time with Biden and Trump. He might force something to happen, but when we see these things failing, within at least.
So first, my question is therefore, if we don't have leverage, the conditions in Israel today, all the things that's happened, the possibility of two-state solution or any state solution, where we are going to have the Palestinians live side by side with Israelis, it's not possible right now. So what do we expect? Because if you don't solve that problem, you're going to have a perpetual war. And we already gone through.
That's one of those. I mean,
it's
a great question, but it's one that doesn't really have a great answer. And my answer is the two-state is a two-state solution. And in Israel, that is not Jewish or democratic.
Yes,
like that's bad for a bunch of reasons. The Israelis are not going to allow a state where they don't form a demographic majority. They have learned time and time again, and I think they're right, that there needs to be a place on the planet where Jews control their own destiny, and their own lives. But a Jewish Israel that isn't democratic, it's not going to be a great place in even the Jewish Israeli centers, and it will potentially put this marginalization and demonization of Israel on afterburners. If you've got a larger Israel with a bunch of Palestinians living in it that aren't even second-class citizens,
or even powerful,
then the apartheid plan becomes a lot harder to dodge. Or you start to talk about sending Palestinians somewhere else, and that's ethnic cleansing.
Assuming we get to the two-state position, who's going to pay to rebuild Gaza?
That is a big. That's good. It's a really good question, and I think a lot of people tend to say the Gulf states in a way that I found consultants use the word synergy, where like they can't get the numbers to match up, and so they just say synergies. It's like you can't get the numbers to match up, and so you just say the Gulfies will pay for it. Like when I've had conversations with officials from Gulf Arab countries, their question over and over again is, what guarantees do I have that anything I pay for, or my government pays for, won't just get blown up again by the Israelis in 5 years? And so there is money, there is potentially money from the Gulf, not all of it, but they're not dummies, and they want to see some kind of return on their investment. That doesn't mean like a 5% ROI. That means that like the things that they pay for stay and contribute to a Palestinian state that is quiet and prosperous and at peace. So some of the money can come from the Gulf. Some of the money can come from the either European states themselves or the European Union. Some of the money is going to have to come from us, and a lot of the leadership is going to have to come from us. These countries aren't going to pony up the cash that we need without leadership from the United States, and a United States that they feel is a responsible actor in the world.
Could it be like an international zone, maybe?
I don't think. I mean, part of this is wrapped up with the idea like Palestinians need to have sovereignty for themselves, and the question is, what provides that governance? In the short term, that people have talked about maybe having like the Egyptians and the Jordanians provide security. I think the Egyptians and Jordanians are a little leery about having to be the people that kind of, point the guns and do the hard work. But I think it needs to be a reformed Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority's got its problems, big problems. The president, Mahmoud Abbas, is like 20 years into a 5-year term. But that represents the aspirations and the consent of sovereignty of the Palestinian people. And I think that has to happen. That has to happen.
One more question.
I know in the back, yeah.
Yeah, I've heard so much talk about a two-state solution for so many years.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's so many people from the river to the sea, and I can't even tell you what river they're talking about.
Oh, they know.
So the government, starts talking about a two-state solution. What do they mean geographically? What do you mean geographically? Palestinians mean geographically because there's a big bunch of land between the West Bank and Gaza.
Yeah. So the river to the sea business, I try not to put a whole lot of stock in like a bunch of people from Paterson, New Jersey, and their ability to drive Palestinian politics or how Palestinians feel about this thing. Anyone who's serious in this, when they talk, first of all, when you say the river to the sea, like take a quick look at who kind of ducks out the door. Like those are the people that you probably want to talk to because they don't want to be associated with that kind of thing. But when we talk about a Palestinian state, right now the Oslo Accords are what everyone still envisages. So what we're talking about are basically the 1967 lines as the basis, but recognizing that there are facts on the ground that make complete adherence to that impossible. There are, so in the West Bank there are settlements and there are settlements. There are the loons that up on the hilltops that are doing a lot of the violence. But there are also places like Ma'ale Adumim, Gush Etzion, which are really just bedroom communities, Jewish. Some of that is spurred by the high cost of living in Israel. And living inside Green Line Israel can be expensive. But these big apartment blocks are not going anywhere. And so the idea would be that those big settlement blocks would get incorporated into the state of Israel in return for land swaps in other places. And where those land swaps are is kind of different. That's where the negotiation and the arguments happen. Is it in the north? Does it include Israeli Arabs? What if the Israeli Arabs don't want to be part of a Palestinian state? What if they would rather be Israeli Arabs and advocate for their rights inside Israel as citizens of Israel? Does it mean a bunch of an empty desert, along the border with the Egyptian Sinai that nobody really wants? But we're going to say we give it to them just so that we can say that we've done land swaps. That's where the kind of rubber meets the road, and that's where the negotiation, some of these kind of final status negotiations would have to be hammered out. Unfortunately, right now, we're not in the place for that to happen. But I think all the serious people when they talk about a two-state solution, they're very much not talking about the river to the sea. They're talking about the 1967 lines as a basis, with land swaps to accommodate for certain large apartment block settlements that just have to stay part of Israel.
Chris, thank you very much.